Any visitors to the South Korean island of Jeju today will find a bustling island filled with natural beauty, beautiful beaches, and idyllic scenery. It's a major vacation destination for Korean and foreign visitors. However, the peninsula has had a dark past, and the island itself was not immune from that. In the late 1940s, an event happened that was so brutal and so controversial it was censored from history books for generations after. This is the story of the April 3rd incident. Welcome to History Unpacked. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. We post every week and we welcome any feedback. So, a little background before we start. In the spring of 1948, long before the Korean War would turn the peninsula into a global battleground, violence erupted on a remote island far from Seoul's corridors of power. What followed was not a brief rebellion, nor a single massacre, but a prolonged campaign of repression that would last more than a year and would claim tens of thousands of lives. The events that unfolded on Jeju Island were buried for decades beneath censorship, fear, and political convenience. Only in the late 20th century would they be formally acknowledged by the South Korean state. By then, many of the witnesses were already dead. Today, the episode is officially known as the April 3rd incident, but that neutral label disguises the scale of what occurred, one of the earliest and most devastating civilian mass killings in the history of modern South Korea. Jeju had always stood slightly apart from the mainland, geographically isolated, economically marginal, and culturally distinct. It occupied an ambiguous place in Korean political life. During the Japanese colonial period, the island produced a strong resistance and labor activism and anti-colonial sentiment. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, liberation brought celebration, but it also brought uncertainty. The Korean peninsula was divided along the 38th parallel, with Soviet forces occupying the north and the United States administering the south through the United States Army military government in Korea. The American military government struggled to establish legitimacy. It relied heavily on existing colonial administrative structures, including police officers who had served under Japanese rule. On Jeju, where memories of repression were fresh, this continuity bred resentment. Food shortages persisted, inflation rose, political parties proliferated. For many islanders, liberation did not feel like freedom. It felt like a transition from one distinct authority to another. By 1947, it had become clear that Korea would not reunify easily. Cold War tensions hardened positions on both sides of the 38th parallel. In the south, plans were made to hold separate elections under the UN supervision, elections that would formally establish a southern government. On Jeju, opposition to this plan was widespread. Many residents feared that separate elections would permanently divide the peninsula. Others saw them as legitimate under foreign military occupation. Left-wing organizations, particularly the Workers' Party of South Korea, found receptive audiences on the island. Their message blended nationalism, social reform, and resistance to imposed authority. But the island was not unified. Political loyalties were fractured. What united many Jeju residents was not ideology, but distrust. Distrust of police, of mainland officials, and of decisions made far beyond their control. The first blood was spilled not by insurgents, but by the state. On the 1st of March 1948, demonstrators gathered to commemorate the 1919 independence movement. During the protests, police opened fire on the crowd. Several civilians were killed. The incident shocked the island and radicalized opposition groups. Negotiations followed, but they were brief and they were insincere. The American military government demanded order. The police prepared for confrontation. The island moved steadily towards violence. In the early hours of the 3rd of April 1948, armed groups launched coordinated attacks on police stations and government offices across Jeju. The assaults were limited in scale, but broad in distribution. Their aim was not total control, but disruption, specifically to prevent the upcoming elections. Approximately 30 people were killed in the initial attacks, including police officers and local officials. From the perspective of the authorities, the rebellion crossed a critical line. What might have been contained as unrest was now framed as communist insurgency. Their response would be brutal and it would be overwhelming. Security forces poured onto the island. Police units were reinforced by right-wing militias and later military detachments. Command structures hardened, language shifted, villages were categorized by loyalty. By late 1948, Jeju was divided into zones. Coastal settlements under government control were labeled white. Mountainous regions suspected of harboring insurgents became red. The distinction was fatal. Anyone found in a red zone, man, woman, or child, was presumed guilty. Entire villages were ordered to evacuate, homes were burned, fields were destroyed, livestock was slaughtered. This was not a series of isolated atrocities, this was policy. As resistance continued in the island's interior, repression escalated. Mass arrests became routine, interrogations were brutal, summary executions followed. Some villagers were killed for providing food to insurgents. Others were executed merely for remaining in their homes after evacuation orders. Families were wiped out. Children were shot alongside parents. One former officer later testified that orders were simple: clear the area. By the time the South Korean government formally took shape in August 1948 under Syngman Rhee, the campaign was already well underway. But Rhee's administration did not reverse course. In fact, it intensified it. Exact numbers are impossible to determine. Records were destroyed, bodies were buried in unmarked graves or thrown into ravines. Modern historians estimated that between 25,000 and 30,000 people were killed between 1948 and 1949. To scale that, that's around 1 in 10 of Jeju's population. The majority of those were civilians. Some died in combat, many were executed, others starved after their villages were destroyed, entire communities disappeared from the map. By the mid-1949, organized resistance was crushed. Jeju was pacified, but it was also devastated. In the years that followed, silence became the law. Discussion of the uprising was forbidden. Survivors were labeled subversives. Families concealed their dead. Children learned to avoid questions. Official histories reduced the events to a minor communist disturbance. Textbooks omitted civilian casualties entirely. Even mentioning April the 3rd could invite suspicion. This silence endured through decades of authoritarian rule, including military dictatorships that governed South Korea well into the 1980s. Jeju's trauma was inherited quietly, passed down in fragments and warnings. Only after South Korea's democratization did the story begin to surface. In the late 1990s, survivors spoke publicly. Journalists investigated. Mass graves were uncovered. Testimonies contradicted official narratives. In 2000, a Truth Commission was established. Its findings were unequivocal. The South Korean state bore primary responsibility for the mass killings of civilians. In 2003, President Roh Moo-hyun issued a formal apology. Jeju was designated an island of peace. Memorials were constructed and names were restored to the dead. And for the first time, the uprising entered public history.